Seraphina's breath came in short gasps as she stumbled through the dark corridor of the ancient temple, her fingers brushing along the cold, jagged walls. The air was thick with the smell of earth and stone, and each step seemed to echo endlessly in the silence. She shouldn't have come alone, but the promise of discovering a relic tied to the lost legends of Beastkin had been too tempting. Now, with her torch flickering and the walls narrowing, a sense of foreboding gripped her chest. At the end of the corridor, her eyes locked onto the relic, a shimmering orb cradled in the claws of a beast-like statue. Its glow pulsed faintly, drawing her closer like a moth to flame. She hesitated, her heart hammering. The stories had warned of danger, but this artifact could prove the existence of a world beyond her own. As her hand brushed the surface of the orb, a surge of energy shot through her body. Light exploded around her, and the world seemed to collapse inward. Seraphina screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void. When the light dimmed, she found herself sprawled on rough stone. The temple was gone. She blinked, taking in her surroundings: towering stone buildings with thatched roofs, cobblestone streets, and the distant sound of water trickling through a canal. The sky was a deep, bruised purple, and the air thrummed with an unfamiliar energy. Before she could gather her thoughts, heavy footsteps echoed behind her. She turned, her eyes widening as a group of beastkin warriors approached. They were tall and imposing, their forms a blend of human and animal: thick fur, sharp claws, and piercing eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. The leader, a hulking figure with wolf-like features, stepped forward and sniffed the air. "A human," he growled, his voice a low rumble. "You're not supposed to be here." Seraphina stumbled backward, her heart racing. "I didn't mean to." Her words caught in her throat as the warriors closed in, their gazes filled with suspicion. "Bind her," the leader ordered. "She'll answer to the Beast Lord." Before she could protest, rough hands pulled her arms behind her back and secured them with a coarse rope. They marched her through the winding streets, past curious onlookers whose whispers filled the air. "A human? Here, she'll bring trouble." They stopped at a massive stone structure that loomed over the city. The door swung open, revealing a grand hall lit by flickering torches. At the far end sat a throne carved from dark wood and adorned with pelts. On it lounged a figure who radiated authority: Darius. He was larger than any of the warriors, his lion-like features both regal and intimidating. His mane of golden hair framed a face that was equal parts fierce and striking. His eyes, a deep amber, locked onto Seraphina as she was forced to her knees before him. "A human," Darius mused, his voice a rich, commanding baritone. He rose from his throne, his movements fluid and deliberate. As he approached, Seraphina couldn't help but feel the weight of his presence. He crouched before her, his gaze studying her intently. "Fragile," he said softly, almost to himself. He reached out, a clawed hand brushing against her cheek. The touch was surprisingly gentle, but it sent a shiver down her spine. "And yet, you've survived the journey here. Fascinating." Seraphina swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to come here. It was an accident." Darius's lips quirked into a slight smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Few things in this world happen by accident, little one." He straightened and turned to his warriors. "She stays under my protection. No one is to approach her without my permission." The warriors exchanged uneasy glances but nodded. Darius waved them off, and they exited the hall, leaving Seraphina alone with the Beast Lord. The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken tension. "You've stirred the city," Darius said, his tone measured. "A human hasn't been seen in these lands for centuries. Some will see you as a threat, others as an opportunity." He stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "But I am curious. Why are you here?" Seraphina met his eyes, drawing strength from the defiance that bubbled within her. "I was studying ancient artifacts. One of them brought me here. I'm not a threat, and I don't belong in your world." Darius tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Perhaps not, but you're here now, and that changes everything." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a low, intimate tone. Tell me, Seraphina, do you fear me? The question caught her off guard. She hesitated, her pulse quickening. Should I? His smile returned, sharper this time. Only if you intend to cross me. Seraphina's lips pressed into a thin line, but before she could respond, Darius stepped back and gestured toward the door. You will stay in my chambers. It's the safest place for you, given the circumstances. Her heart sank. The thought of being so close to him, this powerful, enigmatic figure, was both thrilling and terrifying. But she had little choice. Two attendants arrived and guided her to a spacious room adorned with thick furs and heavy wooden furniture. A large bed dominated the center, and the air was warm from the crackling fire in the hearth. The attendants left without a word, and Seraphina found herself alone. Moments later, the door creaked open, and Darius entered. His presence filled the room, and Seraphina's nerves prickled with awareness. He crossed the distance between them with deliberate strides, his eyes never leaving hers. I've arranged for clothes and food, he said, his tone softer now. You'll need to adapt quickly if you're to survive here. Seraphina nodded, her throat dry. Why are you helping me? Darius paused, his gaze intense. Because you intrigue me, he admitted. Your presence here is unprecedented, and I intend to understand why. He stepped closer, his hand brushing a strand of hair from her face. The touch lingered, and for a moment, the air between them grew heavy with unspoken tension. Seraphina's breath hitched, her heart pounding in her chest. You're different, Darius murmured, his voice like a velvet growl. And in this world, difference can be powerful. Without another word, he turned and left the room, leaving Seraphina alone with her racing thoughts and the realization that her life had irrevocably changed. The fire in Darius's chambers crackled softly as Seraphina sat on the edge of the bed, her gaze fixed on the flames. Her mind raced with questions, but none of them had answers. This world, these people, beastkin, were beyond anything she could have imagined. And Darius, he was an enigma. His presence was overwhelming, his touch unexpectedly gentle, and his words carried a weight she couldn't ignore. The door opened, and Seraphina instinctively tensed. Darius stepped inside, his golden eyes flicking to her as he closed the door behind him. He carried a tray of food, which he placed on the table near the hearth. You didn't eat earlier, he said, his voice low but firm. You'll need your strength. Seraphina hesitated before moving to the table. The food was unfamiliar but smelled delicious. She took a small bite, and the flavors surprised her, rich and hearty. Darius watched her in silence, his intense gaze making her self-conscious. Why are you doing this? She asked finally, breaking the quiet. Why do you care if I eat? Darius leaned against the wall, arms crossed. You are under my protection. If you're weak, you're vulnerable, and I won't allow harm to come to you while you're in my care. His words were practical, but there was something more in his tone, something protective. Seraphina set her fork down, meeting his gaze. You speak like I'm some valuable object, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. But I'm just a person, a human. Darius's eyes softened slightly. You are more than that here. To my people, you are a legend made flesh. Some will fear you, others will covet you, but all will watch you. The weight of his words settled heavily on her shoulders. She had no idea how to navigate this world, and the thought of being constantly scrutinized made her stomach twist. Seeing her discomfort, Darius pushed off the wall and walked toward her. You're not alone in this, he said quietly, his deep voice sending a shiver down her spine. I will ensure you learn what you need to survive. Seraphina's gaze flicked up to meet his, and for a moment, they were locked in a silent exchange. His eyes were steady, unwavering, but there was a warmth in them that caught her off guard. She nodded, unsure of what else to say. Over the next few days, Darius kept his word. He stayed close, guiding her through the customs and rules of his world. He showed her how the beastkin hierarchy worked, explaining the delicate balance of power between the tribes. His presence was a constant, both comforting and unnerving. One evening, As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of violet and gold, Darius led Seraphina to a secluded terrace overlooking the city. The air was cool, carrying the distant sounds of life in Umbra Hollow. Seraphina leaned against the railing, taking it all in. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Darius stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "This city is my responsibility," he said. "Every life within it depends on my strength, my decisions. It is a burden I cannot escape." Seraphina glanced at him, noting the tension in his jaw, the weight in his eyes. For all his power and confidence, he carried a deep sense of duty. "Do you ever wish you could walk away?" she asked. Darius's lips curved into a small, bitter smile. "No, it is who I am. To abandon it would be to abandon myself." The honesty in his words struck her. She had never considered the loneliness that might come with such a position. Tentatively, she reached out, her fingers brushing his arm. His gaze shifted to her, surprise flickering in his eyes. "You don't have to carry it alone," she said quietly. Darius's eyes darkened, his expression unreadable. He turned toward her, and the space between them seemed to shrink. His hand lifted, his fingers trailing lightly along her jaw. The touch was electrifying, sending warmth coursing through her. "You are unlike anyone I've ever known," he murmured, his voice low and intimate. "Fragile, yet strong. Fearful, yet brave." Seraphina's breath hitched as his thumb brushed her cheek. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't look away. The intensity in his gaze held her captive, and for a moment, the world around them faded. Before she could overthink it, Darius leaned in, his lips hovering just above hers. The anticipation was almost unbearable, and when their lips finally met, it was like a spark igniting a flame. His kiss was firm yet gentle, filled with a restrained passion that made her knees weak. Seraphina's hands found their way to his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath her fingertips. Darius deepened the kiss, his hands sliding to her waist, pulling her closer. The heat between them was undeniable, and for a moment, she allowed herself to get lost in it. But then, reality intruded. Seraphina pulled back, her breathing uneven. Darius looked at her, his expression a mix of longing and restraint. I need time," she said softly. Darius nodded, his hand lingering on her waist for a moment before he stepped back. "Of course." The tension between them remained as they stood in silence, the cool night air doing little to cool the heat that had built between them. Seraphina turned back to the railing, trying to steady her thoughts. Darius remained at her side, his presence grounding her even as her mind raced. Though they said nothing more, the connection between them was undeniable, and Seraphina knew that her journey in this world was only just beginning. The days following their shared kiss were charged with an unspoken tension. Seraphina found herself acutely aware of Darius's presence at all times, the way his eyes lingered on her, the subtle shifts in his demeanor when they were alone. Yet, despite the lingering heat between them, he gave her space, though it was clear the restraint cost him. She appreciated his patience, but it didn't ease the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. One afternoon, Darius summoned her to a private meeting room. As she entered, she noticed a map sprawled across a large wooden table, marked with symbols and lines she couldn't decipher. Darius stood at the far end, his expression grave. "We need to talk," he said, gesturing for her to sit. Seraphina took a seat, her pulse quickening. "What's going on?" "There's unrest brewing among the tribes," Darius explained. "Your presence here has not gone unnoticed. Some see it as an opportunity to challenge my authority." She frowned, guilt washing over her. "This is because of me." Darius shook his head, his tone firm. "No, the tensions were there long before you arrived. You've only given them a new excuse to act." He leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "One of the rival leaders, Kale, has been particularly vocal. He's demanding you be handed over." Seraphina's stomach dropped. "What does he want with me?" Darius's jaw tightened. "Power. Kale is ambitious, and he'll use you as a bargaining chip to rally support against me." His amber eyes locked onto hers, fierce and unwavering. But that won't happen. You're under my protection. The weight of his words settled over her, both reassuring and heavy. She knew Darius was powerful, but the thought of being the cause of conflict between him and his people unsettled her. What do we do? She asked. For now, we wait and watch, Darius said. But you need to be prepared. Things could escalate quickly. The gravity of the situation hung between them. Serafina nodded, her resolve hardening. She wouldn't be a passive observer. If there was a way to help, she would find it. That night, Serafina couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, her thoughts racing. The quiet hum of the city outside only amplified the storm within her. Finally, she gave up on rest and wandered to the terrace. The cool night air brushed against her skin, offering a small reprieve from her restless mind. She wasn't alone for long. The soft sound of footsteps announced Darius's arrival. He joined her without a word, standing close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. They gazed out over the city in silence, the shared quiet both comforting and charged. You're worried, Darius said after a while, his voice low. Serafina sighed. How could I not be? I don't belong here, and now I'm at the center of something I don't fully understand. Darius turned to face her, his expression softening. You belong more than you think. You've shown strength and courage, even in the face of uncertainty. That's more than most can say. His words warmed her, but they also stirred something deeper. She looked up at him, her heart pounding as she met his steady gaze. Darius, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, his hand lifting to cup her cheek. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver through her, and she leaned into it, her eyes fluttering closed. When she opened them again, Darius was watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. You don't have to carry this burden alone, he said softly. I'll stand by you no matter what. Before she could respond, the sound of distant shouting shattered the moment. Darius's expression hardened instantly, and he turned toward the noise. Stay here, he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Serafina grabbed his arm. Be careful. He gave her a quick nod before disappearing into the shadows. Serafina's heart raced as she watched him go, a sense of dread settling in her chest. She knew she couldn't just stand by and do nothing. If Darius was in danger, she needed to help. Ignoring his command, she slipped back into the room and grabbed a cloak to conceal herself. She followed the sounds of commotion, her steps careful but quick. The city's winding streets felt unfamiliar and disorienting in the dark, but she pressed on, determined. She soon found herself near the central square, where a crowd had gathered. At the center stood Darius, his powerful form a stark contrast to the smaller figures around him. Facing him was Kale, the wolf Darius had warned her about. His sharp features were twisted in a sneer, his silver eyes gleaming with defiance. You can't protect her forever, Darius, Kale snarled. The people deserve answers. She is under my protection, Darius replied, his voice steady and authoritative. Anyone who challenges that will answer to me. Kale laughed, a cold, humorless sound. You think your title will keep you safe? The tribes are restless, and your hold is slipping. It's only a matter of time before someone takes what you're too weak to defend. The tension in the square was palpable, and Serafina's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to call out, to tell Kale that this wasn't Darius's fault, but she knew it would only make things worse. Kale took a step closer, his posture aggressive. You can't stop what's coming, Darius. Your time as Beast Lord is ending. Darius didn't flinch. We'll see about that. The crowd murmured, their loyalty divided. Serafina could feel the weight of their uncertainty, the cracks in Darius's authority that Kale was exploiting. She clenched her fists, frustration and fear bubbling to the surface. As Kale turned to leave, his eyes briefly flicked toward Serafina's hiding spot. For a terrifying moment, she thought he might have seen her. But then he disappeared into the crowd, leaving a sense of unease in his wake. Darius remained in the square for a moment longer before returning to the terrace, where Serafina waited. His expression was grim, but when he saw her, A hint of relief softened his features. "I told you to stay," he said, his tone more weary than reprimanding. "I couldn't just sit and do nothing," she replied, her voice firm despite the fear still coursing through her. Darius sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Kale won't stop. He's testing the limits, trying to see how far he can push before the tribes turn on me." Serafina stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm. "Then we'll find a way to stop him. Together." Darius looked at her, his eyes searching hers. Slowly, he nodded. "Together." The resolve in his voice was unshakable, and Serafina knew that no matter what lay ahead, they would face it side by side. The following days were a blur of tension and preparation. Darius's presence became a constant, his protective instincts more pronounced as the threat from Kale loomed over them. Serafina noticed how the beastkin guards around the palace moved with sharper focus, their eyes always scanning for danger. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on her, but she refused to let it break her resolve. Darius rarely left her side. Whether it was walking through the palace halls or sitting together in the private library, his presence was both a shield and a reminder of the danger they faced. Serafina found herself drawn to his strength and calm, even as her own nerves frayed. Yet, despite the turmoil, there were moments of quiet between them that felt almost normal. One such moment came late in the evening. The city had settled into a tense quiet, and the two of them sat by the fire in Darius's chambers. He had poured them each a cup of a warm, spiced drink that filled the room with a comforting aroma. Serafina cradled her cup in her hands, letting the heat seep into her palms. "You've been quiet," Darius observed, his deep voice breaking the silence. He watched her over the rim of his cup, his gaze thoughtful. Serafina sighed, staring into the fire. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened. About Kale, about this world, and about how I fit into all of it." Darius set his cup down and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You've adapted quickly, despite the circumstances. Many would have broken under the pressure." She looked up at him, a small, rueful smile tugging at her lips. "Maybe, but I still feel like I'm standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to give way." Darius reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on her knee. His touch was warm, steadying. "You're stronger than you think, Serafina. You've proven that time and time again." Her heart fluttered at his words, at the sincerity in his gaze. For all his strength and authority, Darius had a way of making her feel seen, understood. She laced her fingers through his, holding on to the comfort he offered. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Darius's lips quirked into a faint smile, but before he could respond, a sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. He stood, his expression hardening as he moved to answer. One of his guards stood on the other side, his face grim. "Beast Lord, there's been a disturbance near the outer gates. It seems Kale's men are testing our defenses." Darius's jaw tightened. "Have they breached the perimeter?" "Not yet, but they're growing bolder," the guard replied. "We've doubled the patrols, but I thought you should know." Darius nodded. "Keep me informed. I'll join the watch shortly." The guard bowed and left, leaving the door ajar. Darius turned back to Serafina, his expression apologetic. "I need to see to this." "I understand," she said, standing. "Be careful." He hesitated for a moment, then closed the distance between them. His hand cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing gently against her skin. The touch sent a warmth through her, grounding her even as the storm of uncertainty loomed. "I'll return as soon as I can," he promised. Serafina nodded, her throat tight. She watched as he slipped out the door, his presence already missed. The room felt colder without him, but she pushed the feeling aside. She couldn't afford to let fear consume her. Hours passed, and the night deepened. Serafina paced the room, unable to shake the feeling of unease. Every distant sound made her jump, her imagination conjuring worst-case scenarios. Finally, unable to sit idly any longer, she decided to explore the palace. Maybe walking would help clear her mind. The halls were dimly lit, the flickering torchlight casting long shadows on the stone walls. Seraphina kept her footsteps light as she wandered, her thoughts drifting to Darius. She admired his strength, his unwavering sense of duty. But she also worried about the weight he carried, the constant pressure to protect his people and her. Lost in thought, Seraphina turned a corner and nearly collided with someone. She stumbled back, her heart leaping into her throat, only to relax slightly when she recognized one of Darius's guards. "Forgive me, my lady," the guard said, bowing slightly. His voice was calm, but his eyes flicked toward the darkened corridor behind her. "It's not safe to wander alone." "I couldn't sleep," Seraphina admitted. "I needed to clear my head." The guard nodded, his posture stiff. "I understand. Allow me to escort you back to your chambers." Seraphina hesitated, but the guard's presence was reassuring. She nodded, and they began walking back in silence. As they turned another corner, the guard's hand suddenly shot out, grabbing her arm. Seraphina's heart skipped a beat, fear flaring in her chest. Before she could react, a low growl echoed down the hall. Both Seraphina and the guard froze as a massive shadow emerged from the darkness. Darius stepped into the light, his eyes glowing with an intensity that made the air seem to vibrate. "Release her," he commanded, his voice a dangerous growl. The guard immediately let go, his head bowing low. "Beast Lord, I meant no harm. I was escorting her back to her chambers." Darius's gaze didn't waver. He stepped closer, his presence dominating the space. "You forget your place. No one touches her without my permission." The guard stammered an apology before quickly retreating, leaving Seraphina and Darius alone in the corridor. The tension in the air was thick, and Seraphina's pulse raced as Darius turned to her, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentler now. She nodded, though her heart was still pounding. "I've fine. I just needed to get out of the room for a while." Darius studied her for a moment before stepping closer. His hand found hers, his touch grounding. "You're safe with me," he said quietly. "Always." The sincerity in his words made her chest ache. She squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his presence. "I know," she whispered. Darius led her back to his chambers, the silence between them comfortable. When they arrived, he lingered by the door, his eyes searching hers. "Rest now," he said. "I'll be close." Seraphina nodded, feeling a sense of peace despite the turmoil around them. As she lay in bed, the warmth of Darius's promise stayed with her, a steady reminder that she wasn't facing this alone. The next day dawned heavy with anticipation. The encounter with Kale's men had left a lingering unease in the air, and Darius's warriors were on high alert. Seraphina could feel the tension in every corner of the palace. She had hoped for a moment of peace, but it seemed that trouble was always just around the corner. Darius joined her for breakfast in the main hall, his expression as stoic as ever, though the faint lines of worry around his eyes betrayed his inner thoughts. He sat across from her, his broad shoulders seeming to carry the weight of the entire city. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Seraphina hesitated, then nodded. "As well as I could, considering everything." Darius gave a small nod, his eyes briefly meeting hers. "Good. You'll need your strength." The way he said it made her heart skip. "What's going to happen, Darius?" He leaned back slightly, his gaze steady. "Kale won't stop until he believes he's gained the upper hand. He thrives on pushing boundaries, testing limits." His jaw tightened. "It's time I remind him why I'm Beast Lord." The words sent a shiver down her spine. There was an edge to his tone, a quiet ferocity that made it clear he wasn't one to be trifled with. She wanted to believe that his strength was enough to protect them both, but the fear of the unknown lingered. "What can I do to help?" she asked. Darius's eyes softened slightly, a hint of admiration in his gaze. "You've already done more than I could have expected. Your presence alone has forced Kale to show his hand." He reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. "But I won't let you put yourself in danger. Leave the fighting to me." Seraphina nodded, though the helplessness gnawed at her. She hated the thought of standing by while Darius faced such threats alone. But she trusted him, and she knew that he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. Later that day, Darius summoned his council to discuss their next move. Seraphina stood at the edge of the room, listening as the Beastkin leaders debated strategies. Their voices were a mix of growls and sharp tones, each one determined to prove their loyalty to the Beast Lord. We should strike now, while Kale's forces are still scattered, one of the council members argued, his claws tapping against the wooden table. No, Darius said firmly, his deep voice cutting through the room. Kale wants us to act impulsively. We'll defend our borders, but we won't play into his hands. Another council member, a lynx demi with sharp eyes, nodded in agreement. A strong defense will force Kale to rethink his tactics. He's bold, but he's not foolish. The discussion continued, and Seraphina couldn't help but admire the way Darius commanded the room. His authority was unquestionable, and even those who disagreed with him eventually fell in line. He was every bit the leader she had come to rely on, and she felt a surge of pride watching him. After the meeting, Darius approached her, his expression softening as they walked together through the palace corridors. "You handled that well," she said, glancing up at him. Darius chuckled softly. "It's part of the job, though I'd rather be out there," facing Kale directly. Seraphina placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but grounding. "You're doing what's best for your people. That's what matters." He stopped, turning to face her fully. His amber eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to fade away. "You give me strength, Seraphina, more than you know." Her heart swelled at his words, and before she could respond, he leaned in, his lips brushing hers in a kiss that was both tender and passionate. She melted into him, her hands resting against his chest as his arms wrapped around her, pulling her close. The warmth of his embrace was a balm to her frayed nerves, and she found herself wishing the moment could last forever. When they finally parted, Darius rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her skin. "I'll keep you safe," he murmured, "no matter what." The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparations. Darius and his warriors fortified the city's defenses, while Seraphina worked with the palace staff to ensure the civilians were ready for any potential conflict. Though she wasn't a fighter, she found ways to contribute, whether it was organizing supplies or offering words of encouragement to those who needed it. As night fell, the city grew quiet once more, the tension hanging heavy in the air. Seraphina stood on the terrace outside Darius's chambers, looking out over the darkened streets. The stars above seemed to offer little comfort, their distant light a reminder of how small and fragile she felt in this strange world. Darius joined her, his presence a steadying force. He stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "You've been strong today," he said, his voice low and comforting. She turned to him, her eyes searching his. "I just want to do my part." "You've done more than that," he said, his hand moving to cup her cheek. "You've given me hope." The sincerity in his words made her chest ache, and she leaned into his touch, finding solace in his warmth. They stood there together, the weight of the world pressing down on them, but for a moment, it felt manageable. Then, a distant howl pierced the night, a sound that sent a chill down Seraphina's spine. Darius's expression hardened instantly, his body tensing. "They're here," he said, his voice a low growl. Seraphina's heart raced as Darius turned and strode toward the door. He paused, glancing back at her. "Stay inside, no matter what you hear." She nodded, her throat tight. "Be careful." Without another word, Darius disappeared into the night, leaving Seraphina alone with the weight of his promise and the growing fear of what was to come. The night erupted into chaos as howls echoed through the city. Seraphina paced anxiously in Darius's chambers, her heart pounding with every distant clash of weapons and shouted command. She had promised to stay inside, but every instinct urged her to run to him, to ensure he was safe. The walls of the room felt suffocating, the flickering torchlight casting restless shadows. Suddenly, the door burst open, and one of Darius's warriors stumbled inside, blood staining his fur. His eyes were wild, his chest heaving. "My lady," he gasped, "they've breached the eastern gate." Beast Lord Darius holds the line, but Kale's forces are pushing hard. Seraphina's stomach twisted. What can I do? How can I help? The warrior hesitated, then shook his head. Stay hidden. If they reach the palace, you must not be found. Before she could argue, he was gone, the door slamming shut behind him. Seraphina clenched her fists, frustration and fear warring within her. She couldn't just sit here while Darius fought for their lives. Her gaze fell on a dagger resting on the table, a simple blade, but sharp enough to defend herself if necessary. She grabbed it, the cool weight of the weapon grounding her resolve. If the fight came to her, she wouldn't be powerless. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the sounds of battle drawing closer. Each clash of steel, each guttural shout, sent a new wave of fear through her. Then, without warning, the windows shattered, and three beastkin warriors leapt into the room. Seraphina's grip tightened on the dagger as the intruders, clearly from Kale's faction, advanced with predatory intent. Their leader, a tall, muscular figure with fox-like features, sneered as he took in the sight of her. The human, he said, his voice laced with disdain. Kale will be pleased. Seraphina raised the dagger, her hands trembling, but her resolve firm. Stay back. The fox Demi laughed, but his amusement was short-lived. Before he could take another step, a massive figure crashed through the door, sending wood splinters flying. Darius. He moved like a storm, his claws slashing through one of the intruders before the fox Demi could react. The room became a blur of motion and violence as Darius unleashed his fury. Seraphina could only watch in awe and terror as he fought with a feral intensity, his movements a seamless blend of power and precision. Within moments, the remaining intruders lay unconscious or incapacitated. Darius stood over them, his chest heaving, his eyes glowing with a predatory light. He turned to Seraphina, his expression softening slightly as he took in her pale face, and the dagger clutched tightly in her hands. Are you hurt? He asked, his voice rough but laced with concern. Seraphina shook her head, her knees threatening to give out. No, but Darius, you. Before she could finish, he crossed the room in two strides and pulled her into his arms. The tension in her body melted as she felt the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. His warmth enveloped her, and for a moment, the world outside faded away. You were brave, he murmured, his hand gently brushing her hair. But you shouldn't have had to face them. Seraphina pulled back slightly, her eyes meeting his. I couldn't just sit here and do nothing. I was ready to fight. A small, proud smile tugged at his lips. I know you were, but you're too important to lose. The weight of his words settled over her, and she placed a hand on his chest. You can't keep carrying this burden alone, Darius. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Darius's gaze softened, and for a moment, they stood in silence, the intensity of their connection filling the space between them. Then, his hand cupped her cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of her jaw. His touch was both tender and possessive, a silent promise of protection and devotion. Seraphina leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. When she opened them again, Darius was watching her with an intensity that made her breath hitch. Slowly, he lowered his head, and their lips met in a kiss that was both fierce and tender. The world seemed to stand still as they clung to each other, the firelight casting a warm glow over their entwined forms. Darius's hand slid to her waist, pulling her closer as the kiss deepened. Seraphina's fingers tangled in his hair, anchoring herself to him as the weight of the night's events melted away in his embrace. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing heavily. Darius rested his forehead against hers, his voice a low rumble. I won't let anyone take you from me. Seraphina nodded, her heart full despite the danger that still loomed. And I won't let you face this alone. Their moment of solace was short-lived as another warrior appeared in the doorway, his expression urgent. Beast Lord, Kale's forces are retreating, but he's issued challenge. He wants to face you one-on-one. Darius's expression darkened, a growl rumbling deep in his chest. Then I'll give him what he wants. Seraphina grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with worry. Darius, you don't have to do this. He placed a hand over hers, his gaze steady. Ego, this ends tonight. Before she could argue further, he leaned down and pressed a final, lingering kiss to her forehead. Stay here. I'll return. And with that, he was gone, leaving Serafina alone once more, the weight of his promise hanging in the air like a fragile thread. The air in the courtyard was thick with tension as Serafina watched from the safety of the palace terrace. Below, torches flickered in the night, casting long shadows across the stone walls. Beastkin warriors gathered in a wide circle, their expressions solemn and watchful. At the center of it all stood Darius, his towering form radiating strength and authority. Opposite him, Kale emerged from the shadows, his silver eyes gleaming with malicious intent. His movements were confident, almost languid, but there was a coiled energy in him, like a predator ready to strike. He bared his teeth in a wicked grin as he stepped into the ring. The murmurs of the crowd hushed as the two leaders faced each other. The tension was palpable, a storm waiting to break. From her vantage point, Serafina's heart raced. She knew Darius was powerful, but the danger Kale posed was undeniable. Kale's voice carried across the courtyard, sharp and mocking. Beast Lord Darius, protector of the fragile human. How far you've fallen to let such weakness dictate your actions. Darius remained silent, his amber eyes locked onto Kale with unwavering focus. His calm was unnerving, a stark contrast to Kale's provocations. Finally, Darius spoke, his voice low and commanding. You've made your choice, Kale. You've threatened my people, disrupted our peace, and sought to harm the one under my protection. Tonight it ends. Kale chuckled, his claws flexing. Brave words. Let's see if you can back them up. Without further warning, Kale lunged. His speed was blinding, but Darius was ready. The two clashed in a flurry of movement, their strikes powerful enough to send echoes through the courtyard. Claws raked against armor, and the sound of heavy impacts filled the air as the combatants tested each other's limits. The crowd watched in rapt silence, their breaths held as the battle unfolded. Serafina clutched the railing, her knuckles white. Every blow landed made her flinch, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. Darius fought with a grace and power that was mesmerizing, his every move calculated. Yet Kale was relentless, his attacks wild but effective, forcing Darius to stay on the defensive. As the fight dragged on, the tension grew. Both warriors showed signs of wear, their breathing heavy, their movements slower but no less determined. Then, Kale feinted left and struck low, his claws raking across Darius's side. Darius stumbled but quickly regained his footing, his growl of pain fueling his resolve. Kale smirked, sensing an advantage. You're strong, Darius, but even you have limits. Darius's response was swift. He surged forward, using his full weight to slam Kale into the ground. The impact was thunderous, and the crowd erupted in gasps. Before Kale could recover, Darius pinned him, his claws pressing against Kale's throat. The courtyard fell silent as Darius loomed over his defeated opponent. His voice was steady, but there was a dangerous edge to it. You've lost, Kale. Surrender, and I might show mercy. Kale's eyes narrowed, his breath labored. For a moment, it seemed he might yield. But then, with a sudden burst of energy, he lashed out, forcing Darius to leap back. Kale scrambled to his feet, his expression twisted with rage. This isn't over. Kale spat, blood dripping from his mouth. You think you've won, but your precious human will be your undoing. Before Darius could respond, Kale turned and fled, disappearing into the shadows beyond the courtyard. The gathered beastkin murmured among themselves, their expressions a mix of relief and unease. Darius straightened, his gaze lingering on the spot where Kale had vanished. His chest rose and fell heavily, the weight of the fight evident in his posture. Slowly, he turned to face the crowd. Kale's rebellion is over, he declared, his voice carrying authority and finality. Anyone who stands with him will face the same fate. The crowd erupted in cheers and growls of approval, their loyalty reaffirmed. Darius acknowledged them with a nod before making his way back toward the palace, his steps purposeful despite the fatigue in his body. Seraphina rushed to meet him as he entered the terrace. Her eyes were wide with concern as she took in the sight of him, his armor scuffed, blood staining his side where Kale had struck. "You're hurt," she said, her voice trembling. Darius shook his head, his expression softening as he reached for her. "It's nothing serious." But Seraphina wasn't convinced. She guided him to a nearby bench, her hands gentle but firm as she helped him sit. Without a word, she grabbed a cloth and a basin of water from a nearby table, her focus shifting to tending his wounds. Darius watched her in silence, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and gratitude. Her touch was careful as she cleaned the blood from his side, her brow furrowed in concentration. "You didn't have to face him alone," she said quietly, breaking the silence. "We're in this together, remember?" Darius reached out, his hand covering hers as she worked. "I know," he said softly, "but this was something I had to do. For our people." Seraphina looked up, her eyes meeting his. "And what about for us?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotion. Darius's hand tightened around hers, his gaze steady. "Everything I do is for us, Seraphina. You give me a reason to fight, a reason to hope." Her heart swelled at his words, and she leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to his lips. It was a quiet, tender moment, a reminder of what they were fighting for. When they parted, Seraphina rested her forehead against his, drawing strength from his presence. "We'll face whatever comes next together," she said, her voice firm. Darius nodded, his resolve matching hers. Together. The night was far from over, but in that moment, they found solace in each other. The quiet of the following morning belied the tension that still lingered in Umbra Hollow. The battle had been won, but Kale's escape left an unsettling void. Darius had risen early, meeting with his council to fortify the city's defenses. Seraphina awoke alone, her thoughts immediately turning to him. Despite the calm, a sense of unease coiled in her chest. She found Darius in the war room, standing over a large map spread across the table. His eyes were sharp, scanning the marked positions of their patrols and defenses. The council members surrounding him listened intently as he issued commands, his voice steady and authoritative. When he noticed her standing in the doorway, Darius's expression softened slightly. He gestured for a brief pause, then crossed the room to meet her. "You're up early," he said, his tone gentler than it had been moments ago. "I couldn't sleep," Seraphina admitted. "I was worried about you." Darius reached for her hand, his thumb brushing lightly over her knuckles. "Ivy Fine. The city is secure for now, but we can't afford to be complacent." Seraphina glanced at the map, her brows furrowing. "And Kale? Do you think he'll come back?" Darius's jaw tightened. "He's too proud to give up easily. He'll regroup, but he won't attack until he thinks he has the upper hand." She nodded, her mind racing. The thought of Kale lurking in the shadows, plotting his next move, sent a chill down her spine. But she also knew that Darius wouldn't face this alone. "I want to help," she said firmly. "There must be something I can do." Darius hesitated, his eyes searching hers. "You've already helped more than you know. But if Kale returns, it won't be just brute force we're dealing with. He's cunning, and he'll use every advantage he can find." Seraphina took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "Then we'll outsmart him." Darius's lips quirked into a small smile, his pride in her evident. "We will." The council reconvened, and Seraphina stayed by Darius's side, listening as they discussed strategies to anticipate Kale's next move. The atmosphere was tense but focused, each member contributing their insights and expertise. As the meeting concluded, a scout entered the room, his expression urgent. "Beast Lord, we've located one of Kale's camps on the outskirts of the eastern forest. It seems he's gathering his forces." Darius's eyes narrowed. "How many?" "Dozens, perhaps more. They're keeping a low profile, but our scouts have confirmed his presence." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Darius turned to the council, his voice firm. "We'll strike before he has a chance to regroup." Assemble our best warriors. We leave at dusk. The room emptied quickly as the council members moved to prepare. Seraphina stayed behind, her heart pounding at the thought of another confrontation. Darius placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch grounding her. I need you to stay here, he said softly. Seraphina opened her mouth to protest, but he continued, his gaze unwavering. Your safety is my priority. If something happens, you'll be the one to keep this city together. She swallowed hard, nodding. Just promise me you'll come back. Darius cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing lightly against her skin. I will. As dusk fell, the city buzzed with quiet activity. Warriors gathered in the main courtyard, their weapons gleaming in the fading light. Seraphina stood at the palace gates, watching as Darius addressed his troops. His presence was commanding, his words steady and sure. When he finished, he turned to her, his expression softening. Stay safe, Seraphina. She reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. You too. Darius pressed a lingering kiss to her forehead before joining his warriors. Seraphina watched as they disappeared into the shadows, her heart aching with both pride and fear. The hours dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Seraphina paced the terrace, her thoughts a whirlwind of worry. She tried to focus on the tasks Darius had left for her, coordinating supplies, ensuring the civilians were prepared for any emergency, but her mind kept drifting to the battle unfolding beyond the city. Finally, just before dawn, the sound of distant horns echoed through the streets. Seraphina rushed to the gates, her pulse quickening as the first figures appeared on the horizon. Relief flooded her as she recognized Darius at the front of the returning group, his armor streaked with dirt and blood, but his stride steady. The gate swung open, and Seraphina ran to meet him. He caught her in a strong embrace, his arms wrapping around her as if anchoring them both. It's over, he murmured, his voice rough with exhaustion. Kale is defeated. Seraphina pulled back just enough to see his face. Are you sure? Darius nodded. We found his camp and caught them off guard. Kale fought to the end, but he won't threaten us again. She exhaled a shaky breath, the tension in her chest finally easing. You did it. We did it, Darius corrected, his hand gently brushing her hair. Your strength kept me going. They stood together as the city slowly came to life around them, the dawn light casting a warm glow over the streets. Despite the lingering exhaustion, there was a sense of hope in the air, a promise of a new beginning. As they made their way back to the palace, Seraphina leaned into Darius's side, drawing comfort from his steady presence. Together, they would face whatever came next, their bond stronger than ever. The aftermath of Kale's defeat brought a strange sense of quiet to Umbra Hollow. For the first time in weeks, the city pulsed with relief rather than tension. Darius's victory had solidified his authority, and the threat of rebellion had been snuffed out. The rival factions that once whispered of dissent now pledged their loyalty anew, humbled by the Beast Lord's unyielding strength. Seraphina stood on the palace terrace, looking out over the city as dawn broke. The golden light painted the rooftops, and the early morning air carried the faint hum of life stirring below. Despite the peace, her thoughts lingered on the battle, on the risk Darius had taken to protect their world. She had never felt more proud or more aware of the fragility of the peace they had earned. Behind her, the soft creak of the terrace door drew her attention. She turned to see Darius stepping out, his presence as commanding as ever, though there was a weariness in his eyes. His armor had been replaced with simpler clothing, and the fresh bandages on his side were a stark reminder of the battle they had just endured. You're up early, Darius said, his voice still carrying the deep timbre that made her feel safe. Seraphina smiled softly. I couldn't sleep. There's too much on my mind. Darius moved to stand beside her, his gaze sweeping over the city. It's a new day, Seraphina. A new beginning. She nodded, leaning slightly against the railing. The people trust you. They believe in you. After everything that's happened, they know you'll protect them. Darius glanced at her, his amber eyes softening. They're not the only ones who give me strength. Her cheeks warmed under his gaze. Despite all they had been through, he still had a way of making her feel like the most important person in his world. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his touch lingering for a moment. Umbra Hollow wouldn't be standing without you, he said, his voice low. Your courage, your wisdom, they've made all the difference. Serafina felt a lump in her throat, but she managed a small laugh. I'm just one person. You're the one who faced Kale and led the city. Darius shook his head, his lips curving into a faint smile. You're more than that. You've changed this place. You've changed me. Their eyes met, and the intensity of his words hung between them. Serafina stepped closer, her hand resting on his chest, just over his heart. She could feel its steady rhythm, a reminder of his strength and resilience. I couldn't have done it without you, she said softly. Darius leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. The warmth of his lips sent a shiver through her, and when he pulled back, his hand remained on her waist, anchoring her to him. You've become a part of this world, he said. My world. Serafina's heart swelled at his words. She had always felt out of place, even in her own world. But here, with Darius, she had found something she hadn't even realized she was searching for, a sense of belonging, of purpose. I want to stay, she said, her voice steady. This is where I belong. Darius's expression softened even further, a rare vulnerability in his eyes. And you'll always have a place here, by my side. He pulled her into a warm embrace, and Serafina let herself melt into his arms. The weight of the past weeks seemed to lift, replaced by the quiet certainty of their bond. They stood together, the city waking beneath them, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Serafina felt truly at peace. As the day wore on, the palace bustled with activity. Darius spent the morning meeting with his council, ensuring the city's defenses remained strong and that Kale's remaining followers were brought to justice. Serafina joined him, lending her voice to the discussions and offering insights that the council quickly grew to respect. In the afternoon, the city held a gathering in the central square. Beastkin from all walks of life came to celebrate the hard-won peace and to honor Darius's leadership. Serafina stood at his side as he addressed the crowd, his voice carrying easily over the gathered masses. Our strength lies in our unity, Darius said, his tone commanding but warm. Together, we have faced darkness and emerged stronger. Let this be a reminder that no challenge is too great when we stand as one. The crowd erupted in cheers, their loyalty and pride in their leader evident. Serafina watched as Darius acknowledged them with a nod, his presence as steady and unyielding as the city walls. When the celebrations wound down, Darius and Serafina returned to the palace. The evening was quiet, the weight of the day's events finally settling. They shared a simple meal in Darius's chambers, the atmosphere comfortable and intimate. Afterward, they sat by the fire, the warm glow casting flickering shadows across the room. Darius leaned back in his chair, his eyes half closed as he relaxed for the first time in days. Serafina sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his. Are you thinking about the future? She asked, her voice gentle. Darius opened his eyes, glancing at her. I am. There's much to rebuild, to strengthen. But with you here, I feel ready for whatever comes. Serafina smiled, her fingers intertwining with his. We'll face it together. Darius's lips curved into a soft smile, and he leaned in, pressing a tender kiss to her lips. It was a kiss filled with quiet promise, a reflection of the journey they had shared and the future they would build together. When they parted, Serafina rested her head on his shoulder, content to simply be in the moment. The fire crackled softly, and the world outside seemed to fade away. In the quiet of the night, with the city at peace and their bond stronger than ever, Serafina and Darius found solace in each other. The challenges they had faced had only brought them closer, and together, they were ready to face whatever the future held.